Chapter 3: The Proletariat and the Peasantry. The Russian proletariat learned its first step in the political circumstances created by a despotic state. Strikes forbidden by law, underground circles, illegal proclamations, street demonstrations, encounters with the police and with troops. Such was the school created by the combination of a swiftly developing capitalism with an absolutism slowly surrendering its positions. The concentration of the workers in colossal enterprises, the intense character of governmental persecution, and finally the impulsiveness of a young and fresh proletariat bragged about the political strike, so rare in Western Europe, became in Russia the fundamental method of struggle. The figures of strikes from the beginning of the present century are a most impressive index of the political history of Russia. With every desire not to burden our text with figures, we cannot refrain from introducing a table of political strikes in Russia for the period 1903 to 1917. The figures, reduced to their simplest expression, relate only to enterprises undergoing factory inspection. The railroads, mining industries, mechanical and small enterprises in general, to say nothing of agriculture, for various reasons, do not enter into the count. But the changes in the strike curve in the different periods emerge no less clearly for this. We have before us a curve, the only one of its kind, of the political temperature of a nation carrying in its womb a great revolution. In a backward country with a small proletariat for in all the enterprises undergoing factory inspections, there were only about 1.5 million workers in 1905, about 2 million in 1917. The strike movement attains such dimensions as it never knew before anywhere in the world. With the weakness of the petty bourgeoisie democracy, the scatteredness and political blindness of the peasant movement, the revolutionary strike of the workers becomes the battering ram which the awakening nation directs against the wall of absolutism. Participants in political strikes in 1905, numbering 1,843,000 workers participated in several strikes, are here, of course, counted twice. That number alone will permit us to put our finger on the revolutionary year in our table, if we knew nothing else about the Russian political calendar. For 1904, the first year of the Russo-Japanese War, the factory inspections indicates in all only 25,000 strikes. In 1905, political and economic strikes together involving 2,863,000 mean 115 times more than in the previous years. This remarkable fact by itself will suggest the thought that a proletariat impelled by the course of events to improvise such unheard of revolutionary activities must at whatever cost produce from its depths an organization corresponding to the dimensions of the struggle and the colossal tasks. This organization was the Soviets, brought into being by the First Revolution and made the instrument of the general strike and the struggle for power. Beaten in the December uprising of 1905, the proletariat during the next 2 years makes heroic efforts to defend a part of the conquered positions. These years, as our strike figures show, still belong directly to the revolution, but they are the years of ebb. The 4 following years, 1908 to 11, emerge in our mirror of strike statistics as the years of victorious counter-revolution. An industrial crisis coincident with this still further exhausts the proletariat already bled white. The depth of the fall is symmetrical with the aid of the rise. National convulsions find their reflections in these simple figures. The industrial boom beginning in 1910 lifted the workers to their feet and gave a new impulse to their energy. The figures for 1912 to 14 almost repeat those for 1905 to 07, but in the opposite order, not from above downwards, but from below up, on a new and higher historical basis. There are more workers now, and they have more experience. A new revolutionary offensive begins. The first half year of 1914 clearly approaches in the number of political strikes the culminating point of the year of the first revolution. But war breaks out and sharply interrupts this process. The first war months are marked by political inertness in the working class, but already in the spring of 1915 the numbness begins to pass. A new cycle of political strikes opens, a cycle which in February 1917 will culminate in the insurrection of soldiers and workers. The sharp ebbs and flows of the mass struggle had left the Russian proletariat after a few years almost unrecognizable. Factories which 2 or 3 years ago will strike unanimously over some single arbitrary police action today have completely lost their revolutionary color and accept the most monstrous crimes of the authorities without resistance. Great defeats discouraged people for a long time. The consciously revolutionary elements lose their power over the masses. Prejudices and superstitions not yet born out come back to life. Gray immigrants from the village during these times delude workers' ranks. Skeptics ironically shake their hands. So it was in the years 1907-11, but molecular processes in the masses are healing the psychological wounds of defeat. A new turn of events or an underlying economic impulse opens a new political cycle. The revolutionary elements again find their audience. The struggle reopens on a higher level. In order to understand the two shift tendencies in the Russian working class, it is important to have in mind that Menshevism finally took shape in the years of ebb and reaction. It relies chiefly upon a thin layer of workers who had broken with the revolution. Whereas Bolshevism, cruelly shattered in the period of reaction, began to rise swiftly on the crest of a new revolutionary tide in the years before the war. The most energetic and audacious element ready for tireless struggle for resistance and continual organization is that element, those organizations and those people who are concentrated around Lenin. In these words, the police department estimated the work of the Bolsheviks during the years preceding the war. In July 1914, while the diplomats were driving the last nail into the cross designed for the crucifixion of Europe, Petrograd was boiling like the revolutionary cauldron. The president of the French Republic, Poincaré, had to lay his wreath on the tomb of Alexander III amid the last echoes of a street fight and the first murmurs of a patriotic demonstration. Would the mass offensive of 1912-14 have led directly to an overthrow of Tsarism if the war had not broken out? It is hardly possible to answer that question with certainty. The process will inexorably have led to a revolution, but through what stages would the revolution in those circumstances have had to go? Would it not have experienced another defeat? How much time would have been needed by the workers in order to arouse the peasantry and win the army? In all these directions, only guesses are possible. The war, at any rate, gave the process at first a backward movement, but only to accelerate it more powerfully in the next period and guarantee its overwhelming victory. At the first sound of the drum, the revolutionary movement died down. The more active layers of the workers were mobilized. The revolutionary elements were thrown from the factories to the front. Severe penalties were imposed for striking. The workers' press was swept away. Trade unions were strangled. Hundreds of thousands of women, boys, peasants poured into the workshops. The war, combined with the wreck of the International, greatly disoriented for the workers politically and made it possible for the factory administration, then just lifting its head, to speak patriotically in the name of the factories, carrying with a considerable part of the workers and compelling the more bold and resolute to keep still and wait. The revolutionary ideas were barely kept glowing in small and hushed circles. In the factories in those days, nobody dared to call himself Bolshevik for fear not only of arrest, but of a beating from the backward workers. The Bolshevik faction in the Duma, weak in its personnel, had no reason at the outbreak of the war of the aid of its task. Along with the Menshevik deputies, it introduced a declaration in which it promised to defeat the cultural will of the people against all attacks wheresoever originating. The Duma underlined with applause this yielding of opposition. Not one of the Russian organization of groups of the party took the openly defeatist position which Lenin came out up for abroad. The percentage of patriots among the Bolsheviks, however, was insignificant. In contrast, the Narodniks, and Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks began in 1914 to develop among the masses a printed and oral agitation against the war. The Duma deputies soon recovered their poise and renewed their revolutionary work, about which the authorities were very closely informed thanks to a highly developed system of provocation. In its It is sufficient to remark that out of 7 members of the Petersburg Committee of the party, 3 on the eve of the war were in the employ of the Secret Service. Thus Tsarism played blind man's buff with the revolution. In November, the Bolshevik deputies were arrested. They began a general smash-up of the party throughout the country. In February 1915, the case of the Duma faction was called in the courts. The deputies conducted themselves cautiously. Kamenev, theoretical instigator of the faction, stood apart from the defeatist position of Lenin. So did Petrovsky, the present president of the Central Committee in the Ukraine. The police department remarked with satisfaction that the severe sentences dealt out of the deputies did not evoke any movement of protest among the workers. It seemed as though the war had produced a new working class. To the considerable extent this was the fact. In Petrograd, the personnel of the workers had been renewed almost 40%. The revolutionary succession had been abruptly broken. All that existed before the war, including the Duma faction of the Bolsheviks, and suddenly retired to the background and almost disappeared in oblivion. But under cover of this quietness and patriotism, and to some extent even monarchism, the moods of a new explosion were gradually accumulating in the masses. In August 1915, the Tsarist ministers were telling each other that the workers are everywhere hunting out treason, betrayal, and sabotage in behalf of the Germans, and are enthusiastic in the search for those guilty of our unsuccesses at the front. It is true that in that period the awakening mass criticism, in part sincerely and in part for the sake of defensive coloration, often adopted the standpoint of defense of the fatherland. But that idea was only a point of departure. The discontent of the workers was digging a deeper and deeper course, silencing the masters, the Black Hundred workers, the servants of the administration, permitting the worker Bolsheviks to raise their leads. For criticism, the masses pass over to action. Their indignation finds expression first of all in food disturbances, sometimes rising to the height of local riots. Women, old men, and boys in the market or on the open square feel bolder and more independent than the workers on military duty in the factories. In Moscow, in May, the movement turns into a pogrom of Germans, although the participants in this are chiefly the scum of the town armed under police protection. Nevertheless, the very possibility of such a pogrom in industrial Moscow proves that the workers are not yet sufficiently awakened to impose their slogans and their discipline upon the disturbed small-town people. These food disorders, spreading over the whole country, broke the war hypnosis and led the road to strike. The inflow of raw labor power to the factories and the greedy scramble for war profits brought everywhere a lowering of the conditions of labor and gave rise to the crudest methods of exploitation. The rise in the cost of living automatically lowered wages. Economic strikes were the inevitable mass reflection, storming production as they had had been delayed. The strike were accompanied by meetings, adoption of political resolutions, scrimmages with the police, not infrequently by shots and casualties.